having the support of other people is essential to thriving in your career. And I often like to share when I have the opportunity to speak or teach on this topic, like I'm doing now, or whether I am in a coaching session with a client, the clearest sign of support is investment. And we'll get to that in just a moment. So, as we are thinking about how can we transition as allies from championing diversity, equity, and inclusion to being a contributor to DEI within the workplace through these allyship skills, it's really important that we understand the dynamics around support. So, we've been talking about sponsorship in this section as the last action in our 5 actions for allyship. And one of the things that is really important is that we understand how relationships are cultivated to even get to sponsorship. And so that's what I wanted to share with you today in this framework that I've built out for building relationships. And you'll notice the word networking isn't on this slide, but you can use that word interchangeably. I know that that is the common language. I prefer to think of it as building relationships because that's really the outcome of your quote networking activities, right? You are really looking to make a meaningful connection with other people and build a relationship. So, this is the pyramid of support. We'll go through each of these 4 levels to really help you to consider how you think about your role, both in terms of building your allyship skills to be support for other people in one of these categories, but also in terms of your own career advancement, what this means for you. And so this framework is included in my new book, Thrive Through It. In chapter 8, I really dive into what does support look like as we redefine resilience and really lead from a space of resilience, communicate with empathy, and then this topic that we're talking about, practicing what I like to call everyday allyship. So let's dive into the first level. So the first level is spectators. So spectators sounds like, or something that a spectator would say is, hey, it's good to see you. And so what I want you to remember about spectators, we often use that word and kind of have a negative connotation around it, but really all of our connections to people, they really start here, right? They start with someone seeing us, right? Observing our behavior, observing, excuse me, our attitude, our response to feedback, right? Observing us, making a perception, right, about who we are. And this is really the largest group in your network or in your level of support, right? And so this is really the base that we build from. And sometimes that someone is a spectator, right? So in the example of, hey, it's great to see you. So maybe this is the person who, if we're visualizing in our minds that we're back in the office, maybe this is the person whose desk or office you walk past every day on your way, to your desk. Or perhaps this is the person who maybe you work with virtually and you're in meetings often together. So you see them on the participants list, they see you on the participants list, but you may not have a strong connection. So sometimes that spectators see you, but oftentimes you don't know. And so it's important, right, to hold in the back of your mind that this level is critical because I think of it as like the observatory lab, right? This is the level of people who are observing you, but also, right, when we think about our allyship skills, we become more socially aware spectators to observe, right, and push past some of the biases that we've talked about to observe, right, the value that other people who may represent a dimension of difference or dimension of diversity um, compared to us, right, bring to the organization. So throughout this learning journey, we have an opportunity to be a more aware spectator, right, when we're thinking about our allyship skills in helping to advance someone else's success. So again, this definitely goes both ways. but we want to engage this level. We want to know that they're here, right? We all have spectators, but we also want to engage. And in that engagement, right, we give spectators the opportunity to move up. So the next level of support is encouragers. So in this group, you want to think about people who affirm you. And so they may provide positive feedback and truly be a source of inspiration and a source of motivation for you at Cat Financial, right? So these are people that, don't necessarily wait for the mid-year review, right, or the end of the year review to give you feedback, but they're consistently looking for moments to lift you up, share a kind word, say, hey, keep up the great work, or that was a really great presentation that you shared. Thank you so much for your insight. And so often, right, although this level is a source of inspiration and a source of motivation, it can also, though, be a source of mismanaged expectations. Now, I want to share with you what I mean by that, because we often, when we're talking about relationship building, and really this ends up being about relationship management, so all of the follow-up process in this, once you understand these levels, but we sometimes can get disappointed because we don't receive the support that we anticipate. And what I like to help leaders understand is that we are in a moment together where we are increasing our awareness to be more proactive in how we show up and support other people. I absolutely believe as inclusive leaders, that is part of our role, that we are the ones that are looking for opportunities to elevate others. And yes, and right, the ownership of your career development is still on you, right? So I'm still responsible for cultivating relationships and building relationships that help me to advance my career, that help me to add value in a more meaningful way and reach the aspirations that I envision. So, because I know that, right, I think it's important that we make this distinction. So, encouragers, although they support you, they're different from this next level. And so, remember, I started out with saying to you that the clearest sign of support is investment. So you don't have to guess or wonder or really even prolong a question about if someone supports you when you ask yourself the question, has this person invested their time, their talent, or their treasure with me? Have they said yes to scheduling time on their calendar, right? Have they said yes to sharing about their career journey or their, area of expertise to help me to develop my skill? Have they said yes to, when you think about your treasure or financial investment from a career development perspective, it can be things like, I can remember being a new marketer and living in New York. And I just transitioned from sales into marketing. And there was this big digital marketing conference at the Javits Center. And I remember seeing it. It was an external organization that was hosting it. And I can remember thinking, I really want to go to this. And the registration was something like 1,500 bucks for 3 days and three very full days of all kinds of learning around marketing. And I remember looking at the screen, right, and pulling together like all of the sessions I wanted to go to, how this aligned to my individual development plan, how, me learning this information was going to add value to the team. And I put all of that in a proposal, scheduled a meeting with my leader, and sat down and had a conversation about why I was asking, him, the organization, to invest in my professional development through registering for this conference. And he said yes. And the company registered for me to go. And it was definitely a moment of not only just learning and growing as a new marketer, but also increased engagement, all of the things, right? From an employer, value and employee, I'm thinking employer value proposition perspective. But I was so excited and inspired and appreciative that my leader was making that kind of financial investment in me, that my leader was approving, right, for the organization to make that kind of financial investment in me. So you want to be mindful and consider, right, where are the opportunities when you think about your connections with other people where you have seen people make an investment in you. And so that brings us to these final two levels that we'll briefly discuss. So the first is supporters. So these are people, supporters sounds like, how can I help you? These are people that ask you that kind of question. These are people that know you are a candidate for a new position. You've put your name in the hat, and they say, "Hey, I'm available if you want to do a mock interview, or if you'd like me to look over your resume, I'm happy to do that." Right? They are willing to make an investment of their time in you, right? To help you to accelerate your success. And so when we cross over, right, to the investors in our network, so when we're thinking about supporters, these people are actively sharing with you. They're actively investing in you and in where you want to go. They do things like write your recommendation, give you advice on how to manage challenges. Maybe you have a quarterly standing meeting with them. And so you really want to be clear about this level of support within Cat Financial, but also external to the organization as well. Now, we're talking in this section about sponsorship, and I think it's important to identify that a lot of people's right community or network of relationships stop here. And it's important, right? If you're going to advance your career, especially if you are, high performing, you have aspirations to continue to move up within leadership, and also, right, if you're a leader that is also intentional and committed to ensuring that leadership across all levels of the organization is representative, then sponsors are necessary, right? So I use this pyramid to visibly represent these levels because you will have less people as you move up, right? And that is intentional, and that is also okay. You are not meant to have the same number of supporters as you have encouragers, or the same number of sponsors as you have, spectators, right? So I would generally say that if you have one, solid sponsorship relationship within your organization, 1 to 2, I think that that is great, right? You're on a great path. So you want to think about sponsors from the position. Now, let me give you an analogy that will help you to differentiate between the two, right? So oftentimes mentors will fall into the supporters category, but they'll differ from sponsors. And so you want to think about, if we consider the cliche of, having a seat at the table, let's take that one. And so we often talk about having a seat at the table. A supporter will come into a room. Let's visualize we're back at work, we're back in the office, and a supporter will say, "Hey, don't sit there. Brittany's come into the meeting. I walked past her in the hall. She's on her way in, and she's gonna, I want to make sure to save her a seat." Right. So a supporter is going to save you a seat at the table. They're going to look out and make sure, that they are invested in your success and invested in ensuring that you have a spot. What a sponsor is going to do, right? The taller order or the next level of that kind of support is that a sponsor has the positional power and authority to create opportunities, right? Or to accelerate your path to your next step. And so a sponsor would come into the room, perhaps start the meeting because it's their meeting, and they may look around and say, "Hey, I don't see a chair for Brittany. Can we hold for a minute and let me go in the closet and bring out a chair and make space for her to sit down?" So, again, very short example, right, in terms of just positioning within a room around a table to illustrate for you that the difference between these two levels, a supporter and a sponsor, is that a sponsor can create a path. They can ensure that you have the exposure and the access to opportunities that, if you didn't have that connection with them, your name likely wouldn't come up in the room, right? Or if your name came up in the room, they're the person, right? As Carla Harris says, if you I hope you watch that video because she is so brilliant at sharing these distinctions, but they're the person that walks your paper in the room, right? And so you want to ensure that you have a really good grasp along these four levels of support, and that as we are developing our allyship skills, that we are intentional about recognizing the role that bias can play into cultivating relationships, into accessing, right, people, particularly at the sponsorship level. Because when you think about things like, for example, affinity bias, it can be really easy, all of us do this, to naturally consider people that remind us of our younger self, right? If you're like me, you've said that before in a work environment, you're like, oh, so and so really reminds me of me, right? Or really reminds me of, something that I did when I, was at that level or whatever the case may be. And that's a very natural thing to think, but we have to understand in raising our awareness that that can perpetuate homogenous teams and homogenous groups due to affinity bias. So the way that we disrupt that is by being intentional and saying, hey, when we get to a position of authority within the organization, and it does not have to only be senior level leaders. So let me just say that, right? So it's not that the only sponsors within the organization are you know, at the BEC level. That's not necessarily the case, right? If you are, thinking about and doing the work here to consider, where do I have gaps? Do I have people across these levels? You can think about your leader's leader, right? You want to think about people who have positional authority, they have influence or power within the organization or within your department, right? So there's all kinds of context in terms of specifics around this that are really based really oftentimes around your aspirations where you want to consider sponsorship towards that path. So last quick example I'll give you just from my own career. When I was transitioning from sales into marketing, I needed a sponsor in marketing, right? Because my sponsors that were in sales, they were fantastic leaders. We had great relationships, but they weren't in any of the meetings with the marketing managers, right? Or the marketing VPs. And so again, you want to be intentional when you're thinking about these levels of support about your path and your aspirations. And so make sure you check out both of the top 10 lists. There's a top 10 list for leaders, so thinking about, how do you show up as a sponsor for someone else? And then there's a top 10 leader for team members, but also leaders, right? If you're considering how to go about building a relationship with a potential sponsor. So you'll see some good nuggets in there, in both of those lists. And then, of course, again, I can't recommend enough ensuring that you watch and rewatch. I have watched that Carla Harris TED Talk countless times, and I always get a new insight from it in terms of the importance of relationship currency. And as we are taking the step to be contributors to a more inclusive and equitable culture, we have raised and elevated our awareness and our intention and impact to show up and support other people across these levels.